We are.
Did you?
We are live.
We are live.
We are live, going across the world. We're calling Chris Anderson. Where might you be?
I might be in Windsor. Where might you be?
I might be in Chicago. I think it's two familiar locations to our millions or perhaps hundreds of.
Well, it's familiar to us.
It
doesn't seem very familiar to me sometimes, but I'm glad it's familiar to them.
There you go. Well, welcome everybody to History Happy Hour. Thank you to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for their assistance in bringing you this show. Check out the rich offering of military history tours at Stephen Ambrose Tours. And Chris, whether you're watching live, whether people are watching live or watching on replay or listening in their car to the HHH
podcast.
Yeah, welcome. And today we'll be talking about the British monarchy and its role in slavery. Chris, before we do that,
yes,
I want to mention this is our 300th show.
Isn't that crazy?
That is insane.
We've outlasted the virus.
We outlasted the virus. 300 shows. I want to just mention that NCIS has done more than 300 shows. So we're kind of like NCIS.
I understand. Yeah.
But the Simpsons have done more than 600.
Right.
So we'd have another.
Some people might say we're like the Simpsons.
Yeah, but we'd have many years to go, even if they stopped making shows. Okay. And do you remember Gunsmoke?
I do.
635 episodes.
Are there any famous programs, though, that we've done more shows than?
Oh, I'm sure there are many.
Okay, well, there you go.
I don't even know those. There's so many. We've outdone so many people. We can't even really.
We lasted longer than Liz Truss.
We did, and that was, I think, by our second episode we had outlasted the Prime Minister.
That in there, yeah.
Hey, and we've done it with the help of all of our Patreon supporters,
absolutely,
especially our top shelf patrons and all of our patrons. We do appreciate everybody who supports us, and you can join the group there for the second 300 shows by going to patreon.com/historyhappyhour. And we did get a note from Louise Goodrich, one of our supporters, who's having trouble getting our newsletter. So if she's listening right now, I'm going to double check on that email and make sure she's getting the newsletter. Okay, so we'll make that happen. Chris, is there anybody watching out there?
There are a few, yeah. Susan Yu from sunny Maryland, Ted from Northern Virginia, David LeGraze from Buffalo, New York, and shout out to Buffalo for remembering all the wars. Oh, Canada, I appreciate that. John Gallagher's from Louisville. Hey, John, hope the tree's doing well. Who else is there?
I don't know. I'm leaving this to you.
Oh, wow. Ken from Kansas. Olga Bielmeyer from Alaska. Damn, that's far, far away.
Okay. It's not a test. You don't have to read.
Well, you kept saying. Well,
I'm trying to,
all right,
keep everybody involved. Why don't you give me a cue, Chris, and I'll get us started on this show.
Well rung.
Oh, thank you so much. So the bar's open, and today we're going to be talking with Brooke Newman, who's written a new book, which is called The Crown's Silence, about the British royal family's centuries-long investment and involvement in slavery from Queen Elizabeth onward. Brooke's an associate professor of history at Virginia Commonwealth University and a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. Her research on the Crown's historical links to slavery has been featured by The New Yorker, BBC, and NPR, among others. Brooke, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Thanks for having me. Congratulations on your 300th episode. That's amazing.
I know, right?
We thought we'd kill each other before.
We were 13 when we started this show. And
you have more episodes than The Crown.
I see. There you go. I knew there was a show.
Okay. Well, now you're already making friends with us. But Brooke, we've heard rumors about your cocktail making skills. So I just want to know what you brought to drink with us today on History Happy Hour.
Today I brought a classic, a Negroni, always favorite.
Okay, excellent. And Chris, I've got a nice IPA.
Is that it? Yep.
Yeah, it's just in a psyop glass.
It's
IPA.
almost the same color as my water.
Okay, there you go. I know you're on a non-cocktail splurge.
Yeah, I'm on a
today.
codeine splurge today. So
So you might be just high enough for history happy hour.
Let's talk about something.
Brooke, your book is about the royal family and slavery, but the book doesn't have the word slavery in the title. It's called The Crown's Silence. So what are you trying to say with the title of your book and with your book?
Well, it does have slavery in the subtitle.
Yeah.
So you gotta give some props to the subtitle there doing the work.
Hang on.
Oh.
Yes, the hidden history of the British monarchy and slavery in the Americas. Okay.
Yeah, in the subtitle. So yeah, the Crown's Silence, this title actually evolved over time. Years ago when I started working on this book, originally I had a really clunky title called something like Subjects of the Crown. It was awful, and I just hadn't quite figured out what I wanted to say. And then I changed it to The Queen's Silence. And if you read the book, it starts off in the prologue with essentially Elizabeth I. And she is denying involvement in the voyages of John Hawkins in the 1560s to the Spanish ambassador, essentially saying, I don't know anything about any of this. And so she is doing what Elizabeth was really, really good at doing, which was never really admitting culpability, but doing things quietly behind the scenes. And then the book also discusses Elizabeth II and how Elizabeth II did not want to acknowledge this history or discuss it. And that's really her MO, generally speaking, as a monarch. She was known for not talking about things that were controversial. She really stuck to things like horses, corgis, things in her wheelhouse. And so the book initially had that framing of the Queen's Silence. But after I had finished it and the Queen had already died and Charles had assumed the throne, I really started thinking more about how this is really a book that is about the institution of the monarchy, and it is about the crown as a whole. And really about the fact that this is history that has not been addressed, that has not really been made aware for the public, and is also not taught in schools. And the more British people, I used to live in the UK also, the more British people I talk to about this topic, the more I realize that this is something that is really important for a wider audience. So that's where the title comes from. It also has to do as well with the idea of silence in relation to the archives and the archives of slavery specifically, because, the archive of slavery is a fraught, dispersed, fragmentary archive. It is designed to silence the people who were the victims of the transatlantic slave trade, the people who were most affected by this history. But there is still enough there to find out about the lives of enslaved people and also to trace culpability, which is what my book is doing.
Okay. So, Brooke, let's kind of start at the beginning. And you say in the book, you say that 1564-65 is a watershed year in this story. So what is it about that year that is so important? Why is that a pivot point?
Because that is the moment when Elizabeth I gives Hawkins the use of her ship. This is the Jesus of Lubeck. This is an enormous 700-ton royal vessel. She has a very modest royal navy that she's inherited. And one of the key pieces of this larger story, tracing the monarchy's role over time, it actually does involve the navy. And so from the very beginning, we see that monarchs don't necessarily have liquid funds. They can't necessarily give people money to support all sorts of different projects. Instead, they rely upon people who are entrepreneurial, people who, like John Hawkins, or later joint stock companies, that people who are pooling their resources, and they will sometimes go to the monarch, whoever the sitting monarch is, and ask for their support. And one of the ways that monarchs tend to do this is by granting the use of vessels that are stocked and that are manned, and that they can essentially give to support an enterprise, and then they will receive a cut of the proceeds. And so this is an important moment in this longer story, because this is a transatlantic slaving venture. This is not a venture in which the monarch is providing, naval vessels for just an exploratory mission or any kind of commercial engagement in West Africa that is just looking at other types of commodities. And one of the things that I do in the book, and I actually was asked this the first time I had someone read a chapter, the first chapter was, it begins also talking about the voyages that came before the Hawkins voyages, because there are many that are going from England to West Africa, and they are not in search of enslaved people to sell. And I think that was a really important point, and I wanted to make that very clear in the book, that this was not just suddenly she is investing in slavery. Instead, she has already been providing vessels. So did previous monarchs. But this is the first time that she's doing it specifically knowing that this is going to be for slave trading, that he has already made one transatlantic slaving venture that was successful and returned to England, and essentially word of that spread, of that success, that he had traveled to Hispaniola and sold several hundred enslaved people into slavery to Spanish colonists without the permission of the Spanish king.
And he's actually, I mean, Hawkins is an interesting character, and he's actually one of the first people to engage in the triangle trade, right? Because he goes up, buys, I guess, or fish in Nova Scotia and brings it back, right? He is sort of starting this thing that's going to be absolutely huge 100 years later or so. And Elizabeth knows, that's what you're saying, that she sort of is trying to be quiet about it at the time, but she's perfectly aware of this, and no qualms or doubts at this point.
No. And then with the voyage that occurs after this, there's also a surviving manuscript document where he specifically says, if you reinvest again, which she does, this time she gives him two vessels, the Jesus and the Minion, I will bring back, gold, sugar, jewels, animal hides, and I will go and get enslaved people, basically, is what he says in this letter. And so this letter is very critical when we're looking at tracing archival evidence to see not just, yes, this voyage occurred, she lent her ships, but that here's a voyage, it occurred, and there is a surviving manuscript from Hawkins to the Queen explicitly stating the intention of this voyage.
And where, I'm just curious, where did you find that? I mean, what did you
find? These are state papers that are in the National Archives in Kew.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Brooke, what is the state of the slave trade when Hawkins and Elizabeth get involved? I mean, obviously there's a pre-existing market that they're going after, right? I mean, where are we at with all that?
In the Tudor period, you've got essentially the Spanish having set up the Spanish Empire in the Americas, and they are not involved necessarily in the slave trade themselves. Instead, they are relying upon the Portuguese. The Portuguese at this point have the asiento, and that is the legal contract with the Spanish crown to transport enslaved Africans to the Spanish Empire in the Americas. And this is a big deal because essentially it is a way for the King Philip, to maintain control over this trade and to make sure that he is, not just allowing any Europeans in his empire. He only wants people who have been officially approved, essentially in Europe, to trade. And so the Portuguese have set up this trade. They have been along the coast of West Africa since the late 15th century. They've set up forts and places like that beginning in the 1480s. And so because the Portuguese already have a toehold and have been involved in the transatlantic slave trade for decades, the English are way behind them, behind the Portuguese in terms of not only transatlantic slave trade, but also trade period with West Africa. And they don't have the kind of territorial claims that the Spanish have in the Americas or in the Caribbean. And so the fascinating thing to me about the Tudor period is how little power England really has on the world stage, that England is a country that has finally, by the time of Elizabeth's reign, a Protestant monarch after a great deal of religious strife, beginning with Henry VIII and his attempts to, get a divorce, and eventually breaks away from the Catholic Church. And then there's a lot of back and forth from Protestant to Catholic and persecutions going on. But by the time Elizabeth is on the throne, she is basically willing, as I tell my students, to stick it to the Iberian powers, because the Iberian powers have what they claim on paper is a near monopoly over trade and colonization in the Atlantic world and in the Americas. And they're also Catholic. And so this has now become a religious issue as well. So it's not just about, we need to expand overseas, we need more territory, we need to have more, commercial interactions with non-Europeans. This is essentially a global war over the future of Christianity and the sort of true religion. And so to me, the story begins in a moment where England is very vulnerable. And one of the things that I do in the book, and I hope I do, is really explain essentially why it would have been appealing to somebody like Elizabeth to invest, in a kind of indirect way in this exploratory slaving mission, but also why after the third voyage that Hawken leads ends up, failing, and he loses a bunch of money, and it ends up, causing more tension between England and Spain, and we eventually get like Spanish Armada in the 1580s and all of that you don't see a lot of English attempts to get back involved in the slave trade for the next 50 years or so. And so it really sets them back, but they get a taste of it in the 1560s.
Well, so heavy duty British involvement in the slave trade begins with King Charles II, who comes in after Cromwell has died. And what is his motivation? What is he trying to get out of the slave trade? Why does he want to get involved with it?
So if we look at someone like Charles II, I think a really important thing to know about him is that he fled England because of the English Civil War when he is a teenager. His father is executed, and he is living on the continent during the 1650s when Cromwell and Parliament are setting up the Commonwealth, when they are radically expanding the English Navy, which is a critical part of the story. Even though Cromwell is not a royal, he plays a huge role in this. And they're also launching the Western design. And that is, in theory, designed to attack the Spanish and essentially like at the heart of the Spanish Empire and take Hispaniola. But what ends up happening is that they conquer Jamaica, which is loosely fortified at the time. When Charles II becomes king in 1660, he has inherited not only this boosted navy that Cromwell has essentially gifted him, he also has inherited Jamaica, which becomes a royal colony. Jamaica is large, it is strategically positioned, and they are already seeing a great deal of success growing things like tobacco in Virginia and the Chesapeake and sugar in Barbados. There are already enslaved people especially in places like Barbados, who are helping to produce these products that are in high demand in Europe. And so when King Charles II comes to England, within just a few months, he is already meeting with his advisors and members of the royal family and plotting, how can we expand into the Atlantic world? How can we start profiting from trade with places like West Africa? And then very soon after that, how can we bring enslaved laborers to the plantation colonies in the English Atlantic world and essentially put them to work for our benefit? So they're not only thinking about the trade itself as a way of making money, because yes, they're going to make money through the transatlantic slave trade by investing in the trade, through subscriptions, through dividends, that sort of thing. But they're really going to be making money through the expansion of slave labor in the English Atlantic world, because when more enslaved people arrive, there is a greater production level of agricultural products. And then there's the customs revenue that the crown is able to get from, the production of things like sugar, tobacco, indigo, cotton, ginger, these products that are highly coveted and in demand. So within a very short period of time after he takes the throne, he's thinking about how to make money, how to build an empire, and how to do it when he doesn't have a lot of liquid capital of his own. And the fascinating thing to me about Charles II, when I was working on this book, is that, from the very beginning, he promises all of this stuff to the Royal Inventors, which is the first slave trading company, and then secondly to the Royal African Company, which is the rechartered version of this company in 1672. But he can't actually pay his subscription. He doesn't actually have enough money. It takes him a while to where he really starts to have some cash flow. So instead, he does what the Tudors and early Stuarts did, which is provides ships and men to these companies and essentially provides material support for the launch of the transatlantic slave trade. And so if you look at the records of these companies, which are primarily held in the National Archives, but there's lots of archival evidence all over the place, but it's very clear that they are harassing the king to try to get him to pay his subscription. Like, Your Majesty, if you would just pay, then maybe other people would pay. And so this is a common through line you see. But at the same time, he's like, okay, well, here's 5 vessels from my Royal Navy. And so they end up working out deals with him where, okay, you're giving us all this protection. He is also using proclamations to defend the monopoly of this company and essentially saying that they will crack down on interlopers or people who are trying to operate outside the monopoly. So he is defending the company's interests in addition to providing material support.
So, Brooke, I'm going to, one of our viewers, Lynn, has a question. I'm going to put it up, and then I'm going to kind of tack on one of my own. So Lynn had asked earlier, what was the position of the Pope concerning the slave trade? And I think he's probably talking about, pre-Civil War, but any 17th century point. And I would just add, you mentioned in the book that Elizabeth supported Hawking's venture, kind of knowing what was involved, what the results of this were going to be. How much awareness was there of slavery and what it meant? And was anybody talking about it? Did anybody even care when she signed on to this?
Okay, so to go back to the first question, or the question. So the papacy, so in the late 15th century, there is a papal agreement called the Treaty of Tordesillas. So this is actually an agreement between Spain and Portugal that is signed off by the papacy. And it essentially is the one that they use to divide up the spoils of the world. Essentially, Portugal is going to get everything to the east of the dividing line, which ends up being West Africa and ends up being part of Brazil in the future. And then Spain is going to get the other part of this. The idea of this from the late 15th century is that they are able to go out, conquer these areas, forcibly or voluntarily convert people, which is part of this story, and purchase and enslave people as long as they are not Christians and as long as they are defined essentially as heathens or infidels. So they are outside the Christian community. This is a very early modern understanding of the transatlantic slave trade and who can be enslaved. So someone who you would be considered your co-religionist, someone who is a Christian, would not be someone who should be eligible for slavery. But that changes over time because, as we know, once they start bringing people to the Americas, eventually many of those people end up converting to Christianity. Right. And so then within different European empires, there's different ways of understanding essentially how this can be justified according to religious justifications. And Catholics, the justification ends up being, well, we're going to convert you to Catholicism, which is the true religion, and in exchange, you will labor for us. And so what we're actually doing is protecting and saving your immortal soul.
Well, that's convenient.
Right.
What a deal.
Yeah, this is something that the papacy goes along with as well. And the Protestants, they do too. And they will also say, because this causes quite a bit of debate in the 17th century, because they're very concerned about, because initially, if you look at the development of slave laws in places like Barbados, they divide it between the Christians and essentially the heathens or infidels. If you're a heathen or infidel, you can be enslaved. But then there's all these questions about, well, what if people convert? And then there's also missionaries who want to, including Anglicans, Quakers, they want to convert enslaved people, just like they want to convert native people. And so if you're going to try to spread religion and Christianity around the world, you're going to come into these sort of complicated scenarios where you're enslaving people that you're trying to convert at the same time. And so ultimately they develop ways around this where they decide essentially we're giving you spiritual freedom and, immortal life in exchange for your work in this life. So that's the answer to that. The second question.
Sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. What? Yeah.
Well,
Okay. Go.
This is something, to me, this is such an interesting part of the story because the book touches on the religious aspects throughout the story because they really come back in full circle during the abolition era. Because by the abolition era in the late 18th century, Christians have now become very concerned about this whole deal that they've been making for centuries.
Especially the Quakers at that point.
Yes. And I mean, and even, Americans, people in Britain, Anglicans, they're all thinking, there's really no justification for this anymore. We can't really say that this is what's happening. Plus, they know that people are not being treated well. They're not truly being converted. It's all just kind of smoke and mirrors. But in the Tudor period, there definitely is some anxiety about coerced labor and what it means, but not when it is applied to either your enemy or to someone who is not a Christian.
Okay.
So that's part of the main issue. But the thing that I think is really worth noting is that the English associate slavery with the Iberian powers. So when they think of slavery, they think of the Portuguese and the Spanish, basically being involved in this, profiting from this. So they are not getting involved in the transatlantic slave trade initially in order to bring enslaved people back to England. That's not even if they do, that's not their ideal. That's not what they're hoping to do because they don't have an empire yet. They don't have anywhere to funnel enslaved people, and they definitely don't want them in England. There's a bunch of really interesting proclamations that Elizabeth ends up issuing before she dies, the late 16th, early 17th century, essentially expelling so-called blackamoors from the realm. And one of the things that she says is that, my Christian subjects don't need these people here because we don't want to have to compete with these foreigners, these heathens, these infidels. They're not Christian and we don't want them in the realm. So, yeah.
You're still having that argument here.
Yes.
Yes.
I want to remind everybody that we're chatting with Brooke Newman, who's the author of the book, The Crown's Silence, The Hidden History of the British Monarchy and Slavery in the Americas. Brooke, I'm going to bring in another question from a viewer. I'm afraid it may not be quite as intellectual as the question that Chris brought in, but nonetheless, it's one that is presented by your bookshelf back there. And Rondri says, your book has 2 different covers. What's the difference? I know you and I talked about this on Friday, but
no, I think I love that question. It's a great question. In fact, let's check this out because it's kind of fun. So this is the American cover of the book. And this was the cover that I and my editor initially came up with. Like I said, I would really love a silhouette. I really want a person to be featured on the cover. And I want the sort of the humanity of the enslaved to be center stage in the cover. But for the British version of the book, the British publisher said essentially that having a person on the cover was a bit too provocative for a British audience, and that actually they wanted to sort of depersonalize this topic by putting the crown on the cover instead. And so at first I thought, wow, that's kind of interesting. But as time passed, I have come to see some of the genius of this cover as well, with the crown and the shackle. So I think they're both getting at the central focus of the book, but in different ways. So yeah, great question.
There you go. Chris, back to you.
Well, so there are a number of legal cases you talk about in the book, so I might just kind of run down some of them. So could you tell us a little bit about Butts v. Penny, 1677, and why that sort of plays a part in this story?
Yeah, so this is in the 17th century. So some of the cases, I'll just say, the legal cases in the book. depending on the time period, there's different moments in the history of slavery that are being worked out. So in the 1670s, and this is when King Charles II is on the throne, it is still difficult to get money back when you are purchasing an enslaved person, or if you are, for example, the Royal African Company and a planter in somewhere like Barbados has purchased an enslaved person or people from you on credit, and essentially like a promissory note, signed a note, given it to you and said, I will pay you back X amount of sugar or what have you within 6 to 9 months. When they would try to then go and collect on this, there was really no legal mechanism in place to do that. And so this case from the 1670s is about this question of how can we define people as commodities? How can we define people as property? And how can essentially people sue to get paid back if someone owes them money? If someone is in debt, for example, can we take their enslaved people as a form of payment? And one of the fascinating things about the Stuart period is that this is when all of these concepts are being worked out. And Charles II supports essentially the definition of enslaved people as property that can be bought, sold, inherited, bequeathed, confiscated for debts. And so that is one of the key legal cases in the 1670s. It essentially defined, or it takes that issue where somebody who was upset that they hadn't been paid and had to do with enslaved property ends up going to court over this whole case. But some of the other cases that end up playing a role in the book later on are about essentially the meanings of slavery in England itself. And so like the Somerset case from 100 years later, they're now asking, now it's 100 years later, people are enslaved all over the Atlantic Empire. There are also people being brought into places like London specifically, and other parts of Britain, but primarily London, who are still enslaved. And one of the questions is, 100 years later, is slavery something that is actually legal in England, or is it only legal in the colonies? Can you actually get your so-called human property back if it flees? And so this is the question 100 years later. And I think the thing that's so sometimes difficult about the English Empire, and in studying it and also teaching it, is that it develops in this patchwork way. Right. Legally, because many of the laws that are passed are local laws. They define slavery in different ways depending on what colony they're in. They completely subvert common law practices. So, for example, slavery is passed down through the maternal line in the English Atlantic world. And this is something that they come up with pretty early. It's happening already in like a customary way, but Virginia passes the first law in the 1660s, essentially saying like, this is how slavery is inherited. It's through the maternal line, which is completely different than English common law, where everything descends through the paternal, through the man. And they're doing this so that enslaved women, the whatever offspring they
whoever
have,
the father might be,
yes, right, they will be born enslaved. And so this is something that develops early on, but the larger questions are not resolved. These larger questions of, well, what happens if you're enslaved and you travel? What happens if you're enslaved in Jamaica and your master brings you back to England? Are you still enslaved? And there's a lot of emphasis initially on like, well, this is just a practice and, it's not a big deal. We're kind of traveling around. But once it actually becomes a legal issue to where there is a case and there is a discussion and then it's disseminated and publicized, that really shifts the foundation of this whole story.
Mm. So first of all, I want to just say, Chris, wow, man, I thought for a minute I was in the paper chase. Where you are Professor Kingsley.
Oh, thank you for that.
Going, Ms. Newman, tell me about the case of Butts versus Penny, 1671. And I thought, wow, you are putting her on the spot. And Brooke,
Brooke,
yeah,
I had faith. So.
You did beautifully. So I just wanted to mention that. Chris likes to dive into the specific here. I'm going to be more general. You trace the personal involvement of every monarch from Charles II to William IV, who's the successor to George III. That's correct, right? I have my British kings correct. I think so.
George IV, fourth.
George IV, and William IV.
Yeah.
Okay, right. I skipped George IV because he's not really important. Okay,
what do you mean? He's the fat one.
No.
George the fat one.
Although he wants you to think that he has the body of a Greek god.
Well,
the Greek gods have fat
do.
bodies, right? So all of these guys supported and women, because Queen Anne is in there as well, supported and profited from slavery. Now, can this be explained simply by venality, or do they see this as connected, sort of completely interconnected with growing this empire that they've started to grow?
Completely interconnected with empire. You really can't separate the two. And I think, if you look at the later Stuart monarchs, so that would be Charles II and James II, they are the ones who were most explicitly focused on individual profit as well as institutional profit. They want to have money that is coming in to their own pockets. For example, James, Duke of York, who becomes James II, when he is the governor of the Royal African Company, he is gifted purses of gold on multiple occasions. He's also the largest shareholder in this company. He is the governor of this company. He's also Lord High Admiral, so he gets a cut anytime there is prize money. So when they capture an interloping vessel and they get to confiscate the goods, including enslaved people, he gets a cut of that. The king gets a cut of that. Because they're so invested in the amount of money that they can make off of this, you can look at this and think, well, clearly they're just greedy and they just want money. But at the same time, they are also expanding England's footprint in the wider world. They are investing in commerce. They are, doing all sorts of things to expand this empire. They're hoping to profit personally, and they're also hoping to not have to call Parliament, which is why they are controversial figures and why ultimately James II is run out of the country in 1688, and also because he's, Catholic and people see him as flirting with absolutism and all this other stuff.
And he goes to stay, by the way, at the Chateau de Quinville, where I'm sure I've stayed, and I'm sure, Chris, you've stayed as well.
Many times.
Yeah,
I have not stayed there.
Well, come on,
you don't want
it.
to. You don't really want
to. I don't know. When I stayed there, they had Wi-Fi in one chair, and I bet it was even worse when James II
one
stayed
chair.
there.
Yeah, I'm sure. It was way worse then. I was going to say, after that, people who, you've got William and Mary and the Georges, all the rest of them, they're definitely thinking about profit and how to increase royal revenue, because royal revenue is something that never goes away. They're freaking out about money forever. That hasn't changed. But the difference is that they're also, each successive monarch is inheriting an empire. And the last thing they want is to be the monarch on the throne when territory is lost. When things go bad. And so they're trying to expand, they're trying to make more money. The more wars they get involved in, the more the national debt increases. And so it's like this vicious cycle of, we need this money, we're dependent on this money, and it's wrapped up in the transatlantic slave trade and in the expansion of slavery. And that is exactly what happens by the time you're at the reign of George III, which begins in 1760. He, even as a teenager, when he's Prince of Wales, is already writing in his commonplace book, which is held in the Round Tower at Windsor in the Royal Archives. He's writing notes while reading Montesquieu that, there really is no moral justification for the enslavement of Africans that, people have used for centuries, that he essentially is like, this is bogus. Does he do anything about it? No. He defends slavery. He uses enslaved people in lots of different ways. He's profiting off of slavery. So he sees it as a necessary evil, essentially.
So one of the things that I found really fascinating, and I'd kind of like to get your thoughts on, they expand into the Caribbean. You talked about how important Jamaica is and how immensely wealthy these planters become.
Mm-hmm.
And as you go through the 18th century, you start to see kind of these planters having an outsized role on British foreign policy and I don't know, empire, all of it. I mean, I contrast that with the American colonies, which are kind of griping about nobody's listening to us,
Right.
and very often when you read about the slave colonies, in Jamaica, Barbados, and all, these guys are calling the shots in a lot of ways, and I kind of like to get your thoughts on kind of the evolution of that.
Yeah. So, and actually, what's kind of funny, because tomorrow I'm talking to the Library of Congress, and one of the questions that they were asking me in advance of the talk was about Thomas Jefferson and how Thomas Jefferson accuses George III of essentially, in the draft of the Declaration of Independence, he says, it's all your fault. You're the reason why we have this slave trade. Right. You wouldn't let us cut it off, et cetera, et cetera. And that all goes back to an attempt by Chesapeake planters in Virginia, essentially, to end the transatlantic slave trade in the late 18th century. And they're hoping to do this because at that stage, they have already received more than enough enslaved people from the transatlantic slave trade, and they have a self-sustaining enslaved population. They do not need to rely on the transatlantic slave trade in the way that the Caribbean colonies do. But they don't have the same level of power or influence as the West Indian lobby, which is what you're asking about, Chris.
Yeah.
And the main reason this is the case is that so many people who went to what was called the West Indies at the time made their fortunes and then returned to London and Scotland and other places and bought property. Many of them end up in the House of Commons, or they have connections. They form a very powerful lobbying group. And actually, the Jamaican agent is the head of the West Indian lobby, essentially, in London. And they have all of these meetings, and they are well connected. They know people in government. They know people in parliament. They know, the royal family. They petition. They're also tight with the merchants and slave traders in these outports like Bristol and Liverpool. And so this is just a powerful lobbying group of people who have a lot of money and a lot of connections. And because many of them have returned to Britain, they're then able to use those levers of power. Whereas the American colonists, most of them don't become absentee planters. They stay. And so their interests are in North America, and they are kind of bound to North America. And the other thing I'll say is that because Jamaica and Barbados make so much money for the empire, that is also the key reason why there's such, the lobby itself is so powerful. And even during the American Revolution, George III, in his papers, he says, I would rather essentially lose the American colonies than Barbados and Jamaica, because those colonies, those slave societies are essentially powering empire in a way that even North America isn't. And it's kind of hard to even imagine that, the idea that you would be sitting in Windsor Castle, imagining, I'll sacrifice North America for, a region that now we don't see as having power, wealth, and influence. So it's just such a different time period.
Yeah.
When the revolution takes place,
War of Independence.
War of Independence.
Thank you.
There are some British commentators who mock the Americans because of their involvement in slavery. Relax, Chris. It's okay.
No, I'm just stretching.
Saying that the Americans look ridiculous. They are, quote, signing resolutions of independency with one hand and with the other hand brandishing a whip over his affrighted slaves. And there's another comment from Samuel Johnson who says, how is it we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes? And these have always been sort of trotted out to show how the British thought that the Americans were being so hypocritical. So one of the interesting things about your book was I wondered, given the involvement of the monarchy in slavery, weren't those guys being hypocritical, or does the British public not yet realize its own involvement in this? Is the silence of the crown sort of already taking place?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. When this is happening in the 1770s and early 1780s, the whole conflict over American independence, the abolition movement is just barely percolating beneath the surface. It is not something that the general public is really aware of. But there have already been, at that point, numerous books published about slavery and about the legality of slavery, about what slavery was like in different colonies, and about essentially the experience of enslaved people in places like Barbados versus somewhere like North America. And so people in Britain are aware that this is an empire where there is obviously slavery. There's still people making money off of this. There's also all of these industries connected to slavery that people are connected to, like the insurance industry, shipbuilding, mariners. I mean, there's just so many ways in which slavery is saturating everyday life in Britain. But they're still not thinking about it in the same way that they do after the American Revolution. They're not thinking about themselves as, we are enslavers, we are profiting from slavery, we are eating pounds and pounds of sugar, our entire world is kind of shaped around slavery. Instead, they are thinking more about, well, slavery is something that happens over there, somewhere else. It's not something I have to really deal with in my day-to-day life. And even if they're profiting from it, they're not necessarily making those connections in their mind about where is the money coming from. And that honestly is still the case now. I mean, when you go to the UK now, there's still a lot of debate about how much should we talk about this? Should these great country houses that people love to visit, should there be signs up? The National Trust decided years ago that they were going to put more educational sort of placards up in some of these great houses that say this art was connected to, this past. And it caused a lot of outrage. I mean, some people were supportive, but there was a lot of controversy at the time too, because it's sort of attacking English heritage and the idea that, you should be able to go to a country house and not have to confront the darker aspects of this. And we've had similar issues in the US with plantations, Southern plantation tourism. People want to have weddings and parties at plantations. They don't want to think about slavery. So I do see some connections there with the 18th century, as much as we think how could they possibly have saw themselves as better than the Americans when they've been part of this empire and they're making all this money. I mean, out of sight, out of mind, 18th century or 21st century. But I do also think that the process of eventually abolishing the transatlantic slave trade and pivoting to abolition is also why this becomes an even more distant memory for people living in Britain. I mean, when I was working on my dissertation, so that was when I was a grad student, this was many years ago, 20 something years ago, I was told by multiple people who worked at archives, slavery is an American thing. They literally said that to me. We don't have a lot of history, we don't have a lot of documents about slavery. And I was like, what? So there was a real disconnect with British history being connected to slavery in a way that American history, we just kind of know this is part of our history. And I think the British only now are really starting to come to terms with this.
Well, one of the other aspects that I found very, very interesting is not just the profiting from it and the whole economic structure that gets set up, but you also touch on I think something I found very interesting. You called them the king's slaves.
Mm-hmm.
So what was that all about? Because that wasn't for profit necessarily. That was, they used, there's something else going on there.
Yes, and that's a part of the story I think that very few people know about. And I mean, even when I was researching it, it was something that I didn't initially know that much about either. And I had to figure that out over time. And there's actually been a lot of really interesting work of people who work on legal history specifically or military history that help to kind of connect those threads. Because essentially the so-called king slaves, this begins under George II, the reign of George II. And I wrote a Smithsonian Magazine piece about this, actually, like just a side piece about, what were the king's slaves and how did this come about? And essentially, prior to the creation of this group known as the king's slaves, when different colonial governments or the Royal Navy, for example, wanted to use enslaved labor, they would rent people from their owners for the day or for the week or for the month. And this would cost the crown money. And so eventually somebody says, why don't we just purchase a group of enslaved laborers in the king's name and for the king's use. And we would base them at like the Royal Navy dockyards. This was in Jamaica and places like Antigua. And then we will train them and we will give them special skills so that they can careen vessels, for example, when they come to dock, and they can have all of these specialized skills. And then within that category of king slave, they start to come up with all of these theories about how the king slaves will be treated better. They'll be treated differently. And this will be a way of sort of showcasing benevolent mastery to the other enslavers wherever this is happening. But the evidence suggests that this was all fine on paper and in theory, but in reality, people who were known as king slaves were still running away. They were still deeply unhappy. They were still put in chains. They were still whipped. This was not a better level of treatment, but there was a little bit more possibility of escape because they're working at the dockyards. They have access to vessels, and they have specialized skills and knowledge, and also just like knowledge that you would get by being involved in any kind of dockyard where you've got ships coming and going and people and products and news. And so I do think there probably was a benefit to being a member of this group, just in the sense that you had a slightly better chance of survival and potentially escape if you were a member of the king's slaves. The other way that people became known as the king's slaves were through things like forfeiture. So let's say you were someone who committed treason, or you did something illegal and the government confiscated your property. They would also confiscate your enslaved people. Or if you died without a will or without legal heirs, your enslaved people would become the property of the king. And this is something that even continues into the 19th century, and that abolitionists within the British government become deeply concerned about in the 19th century, because they're like, why do we still have all of these people technically owned by the monarch? This is really bad. And then the abolitionists then start writing about this and trying to make the public aware of it, that like even the king has, enslaved people and is not treating them well and is selling them for profit. And, this is so awful. And so ultimately the king's slaves are emancipated in 1831. So just a few years before official emancipation. But it's interesting that it takes so long for this to happen. And they are concerned about it, like 20 years before that. And the wheels of this whole system take a very long time.
So as we approach the end of our show, I want to bring up a question from one of our audience members that sort of circles back to where we were at the beginning. Lynn Hargrove says, why should Elizabeth II acknowledge Elizabeth I's involvement with the slave trade? How is the current monarchy profiting from the slave trade? And I will add to this, it seems to me, Brooke, that your book is written in a very dispassionate historical tone, but underneath that, one senses a lot of anger about what has gone on and about how it's dealt with now. So how would you wrap that up?
Well, I would say, as someone who works on the history and legacies of slavery, I've devoted my whole career to this. It's very hard to not feel empathy for the enslaved and for people who were forced into slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. We're talking about millions and millions of people. Is a crime against humanity, and it's really, really awful. And to look at these kinds of records, the records of brutal punishments and death day after day after day, is very sobering. It's a heavy topic. At the same time, to see that there is an institution of the monarchy that is absolutely based entirely on hereditary privilege and hereditary status. The only reason why Charles III is the king is because he inherited that position, and he got that passed down to him over the successive generations and centuries. And so you can't have an institution that exists solely on the basis of hereditary privilege and power and not have any kind of acknowledgement of what came before, of what enriched that institution, of what enabled that institution to survive, of what gave birth to modern Britain, essentially. Acknowledgement is just the first step. And I do think Elizabeth II should have acknowledged this. She didn't. I'm not surprised that she didn't. And I won't be surprised if Charles doesn't either. But I do think from a historical perspective that these moments of acknowledgement are really important, because it's not just hollow or some kind of empty gesture when a government or an entity like a monarchy acknowledges, yes, this institution profited from and defended and expanded slavery. And obviously now we know that this was bad. I think that's a good thing. And I think it's only positive development for a 21st century monarchy to do, rather than to continue not to talk about these issues. But this has become, unfortunately, part of the larger sort of culture wars. This question of slavery, but also of empire, especially in the UK. I lived in the UK for a number of years, but that now it's been about 20 years ago. And it was not as fraught then. There seemed to be 20 years ago a bit more emphasis on, empire had these effects, but overall, this was not a good thing. Imperialism, that has really shifted. There's been a real backlash to this larger attempt to talk about the past and to acknowledge the past and to put up signs essentially saying this object was derived from slavery or money, blood money, essentially. And so I don't think, as a historian, it isn't my job to say what happens next or what the British government and what Charles should do. But I would hope that this kind of history would be important enough and would be, something worth acknowledging and something that would enable to have a process of repair to occur. And I know that there are multiple groups within the UK, within the Commonwealth realms, in Africa, CARICOM, who want to see action on this issue, and it's not going away. So it doesn't really matter what I say. There are plenty of other stakeholders and descendants of enslaved people who will continue to push this issue and not let it die.
Well, Brooke Newman, thank you so much for joining us today on History Happy Hour to talk about your book, The Crown's Silence, The Hidden History of the British Monarchy and Slavery in the Americas. It's been a really interesting discussion, and we really appreciate your being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks very much.
All right, thank you.
Good luck, Brooke.
Sorry, Chris, did I interrupt you?
Good luck. Thanks. I was being polite. You just cut past it.
Okay.
Cheers.
Very good. Thank you. Next week, Chris, we will not only be live, we will be
together.
Live together.
Wow. It's like a Coke commercial.
Someplace in the UK. It's top secret.
It is.
It's a hotel. I don't know.
Surprise. I hope it's a hotel. There better be a hotel.
You can come to my room. I'll come to your room. I don't know.
All right.
But we'll be talking to Robert Edsel. He's the guy who wrote the Monuments Men book. And he's out with another book, which is called Remember Us. It is about World War II fighting in the Netherlands, the impact on soldiers and civilians, and the efforts of the Dutch to remember. And it's sort of interesting that we're going to be talking about this as we're doing a tour, because of course we'll be in the Netherlands, we'll be at the cemetery there, and the Dutch have really been heroic in their efforts to remember what the Americans did in World War II, and that's one of the topics of that tour that we'll be taking people on.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it.
Yeah. So guys, please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Blue Sky, listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon, browse historyhappyhour.com, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.